called creation was at stake. So I'll introduce myself and our eminent session participants in a minute, but first I want to introduce our topic. So most of us tend to think of central banks as the issuers of money. And yet the greatest share of the money supply, in most countries well above 90%, consists of money issued by commercial, not central banks. And central bank money dominates not only the stock, but no less the flow. Most of us, or in fact, the principal way by which money is created in the present day society is through the act of commercial banks making loans. To make this concrete, when you go to the bank to get a loan, say to buy a beautiful house, the money with which you leave the bank was just created for you by the bank in order to facilitate this loan transaction. So in other words, unlike other financial institutions, and unlike us mortals, commercial banks can and routinely do create the very money they lend. So what does this ability of commercial banks to create money mean for the banking system, for credit markets, for the macroeconomy, for the society at large? Well, among economists, the conventional answer is not that much at all. And the reasoning behind this claim is that setting aside times of financial turbulence that have their own complicated dynamics, the fact that commercial banks can create money merely translates into a greater money supply, which in turn merely translates into a rise of nominal prices. But once adjusted, the fact that nominal prices are higher matters little more than if we call our money dollars or yen or pounds. And therefore, the reasoning goes, little is lost if we omit the role of commercial banks as creators of money in our economic models. And accordingly, commercial banks are ultimately understood as mere intermediaries, that is, as entities that move funds from savers to borrowers, facilitating this flow of funds, but without creating any money by themselves. And such, for example, is how the bank is modeled in the famous Liability work from '83, which just won the Nobel Prize. But in this session, you'll find 4 economists who disagree with the proposition that commercial banks and their function in society at large can be understood without reference to their creation of money. And we'll all try to tell you what's at stake here. That is exactly what are we missing when modeling and understanding banks without taking into account their role as creators of money. So with me to tackle this question, I have Professor Steve Keen, Honorary Professor of Economics at the University College London, and Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security. And we also have Dr. Michael Kumhof with us from Zoom, Senior Research Advisor in the Research Hub at the Bank of England, and myself. My name is Mehrling, and I'm a doctoral student at the European University Institute and a Safra Fellow at Tel Aviv University. In addition, we are honored to have as our session's commentator Professor Mehrling, Professor of International Political Economy at the Portuguese School of Global Studies, Boston University. And so I will leave the floor to you, Christine.
Okay. Take off my mask while I talk. Okay. This is working okay. I'm worried about getting feedback between Zoom and the room. It's all right? Good. Okay, thank you. All right, I'll share my screen. And let's see. Right. Okay. Okay. So I've just taken the title of the session as my title here. And I'll just minimize this as well. Let's see. Okay. What's at stake? A certain author, perhaps she's in the room at the moment, made this comment about the textbook treatment of money, to say that the money supply affects nominal variables, not real ones. By the way, notice she's quoting another Harvard resident here, Gregory Mankiw. This is what 99% of economists learn, and most of them believe, unfortunately. And what you've got is a division of the world that are real and nominal, and the monetary system affects the nominal but not the real. And I can prove that false in about 5 minutes, which I'm going to do now. And that's using what I call Moore tables in honour of Basil Moore, who was one of the originators of the endogenous money approach that dominates post-Keynesian economics. So the idea is to divide the economy into sectors. I'm just using 3 sectors here, but if I did this for the entire economy, so every person and every business had a single column, what I'd be showing is the exact measure of general gross domestic products, both in terms of expenditure and income. So you divide the economy into sectors, and I'm just doing a 3-sector model here. So I've got households, services, and manufacturing. And so what I'm showing here is, on the horizontal, I've got spending by households on services and manufacturing. So they spend $8 per year on services, $B per year on manufacturing. The same for services and the same for manufacturing on the other 2 sectors. Now, when you add up the sum of the negative of the diagonals, that is aggregate expenditure. Okay? The negative of the diagonals. Equally, the sum of the off diagonal is aggregate income. And they are necessarily equal. Okay? That's why economists will say expenditure is income. Okay? What you spend becomes income for somebody else. So if I do the mathematics very simply, take the negative of the sum of the diagonals, I get exactly the same sum as the positive of the sum of the off diagonals. That's the basic concept. Now, of course, that's imagining a constant stock of money with no creation of money and no lending. So what happens when we bring in lending? Now, I'm going to bring in the neoclassical myth of loanable funds, which, of course, they gave the Nobel Prize, or should we call it the Ig Nobel Prize, to Ben Bernanke last year, where banks are modelled as just intermediaries. What they do is they enable savers to lend to borrowers, but they don't do lending themselves. I call this, by the way, the Ashley Madison theory of banking. Ashley Madison won't actually do you, but they'll introduce you to somebody else who'll do you, and then charge an introduction fee. That is basically how neoclassicals model banks. So what you have here is the service sector is lending credit dollars per year to households. And of course, that's because it's not a sale that goes along the diagonal, it's a transfer. And then because the reason they're doing it is households will then pay interest dollars per year to the services sector. That's why you make a loan in the first place. And then having got the money, which is credit dollars per year from the services sector, the households then spend that money on manufacturing. And that's the basic logic of loanable funds. Now, when you add up the same process they did for the no lending model beforehand, what you find is credit cancels out. There's a positive and a negative entry for credit in the expenditure column. There's equally one for the income columns. There's equally one for that in 2 entries in the expenditure. So credit cancels out. But interest remains. I don't know that neoclassicals are aware of this. Probably not, because as me will say later, they prefer not to think about money. So their models are really there not to explain money, but to explain why they don't use money in macroeconomics. That's the whole role of their models of money. But interest does remain. So aggregate expenditure and aggregate income now both include interest payments. So if loanable funds were correct as a model of the real world, then credit would not matter. But it's not correct. And you can see it just by looking at the data, which of course is something that neoclassicals never do in a raw sense. They torture it until it confesses what they want to hear through econometrics. This is just looking at the long-term data for private debt, which is the top chart up there, and then down the bottom, change in private debt, which is credit, and the unemployment rate. Now, if you can't see almost perfect negative relationship between credit and unemployment, I think you should go for therapy rather than a degree in economics. Okay? It's ridiculous over the long term how strongly negatively correlated they are. The obvious reason is when credit goes up, unemployment goes down and vice versa. So it's fundamentally important to the economy. So we have to explain why. And the explanation is banks are not intermediaries. That is a myth. They're creators of money and debt. And rather than calling it endogenous money, which I think is a term that only makes sense to practitioners in the field, I've come up with the term bond. Bank originated money and debt. Okay? That's what we're really talking about. We live in a world which is being bombed. So we include the banks then. We have to now have both the assets and the liability side of the banking sector, because the liability side of the banking sector, plus the short-term equity that banks have, to bring that in, and happy to discuss what I mean by that later, we transact by transferring money between the liability accounts and the short-term equity account of the banking sector. And when a bank now makes a loan, what it does is it increases its assets by adding credit dollars per year to the outstanding loans, and it increases its liabilities by putting credit dollars per year into the household account. And because nobody borrows for the sheer pleasure of being in debt, that money is spent and goes across to the manufacturing sector. Now, when you do your sums now, what you find is credit does not cancel out. There's a single entry for credit in expenditure. There's a single entry for credit in income. And therefore, when you do your sums, credit is part of aggregate expenditure and income. Now, I've got to go more broadly here. Of course, we spend this money not just on goods and services, but also assets. So we have to generalise our analysis to combine the goods market as well as the assets market. But the key takeaway is credit is a significant and by far the most volatile part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. And that's why we get the volatility in the real world. And that's what's ignored by mainstream economics. It's no wonder they don't see catastrophes coming, while enabling them at the same time by deregulating the banking sector. And the key point, a major point here is credit's more volatile, can vary dramatically, and I'll show you some examples later of just how much it does vary, but credit also can go negative. When debt's being paid down, the change in credit, the change in debt is negative. That doesn't happen to transactions demand. So it's much more volatile, and it can have negative side as well as positive. And it drives the macroeconomy. When you take a look at the aggregate data I showed you a moment ago, the top level is the ratio of private debt to GDP. The bottom chart is the change in private debt per year divided by GDP. Now, when I first produced that chart, of course I knew about the Great Depression and the Great Recession, but I didn't know what this was. I had to look it up. Off to Wikipedia. What happened in 1837? The Panic of 1837, which was a substantial period of negative credit as we saw back in the Great Depression. So that's how explanatory credit is as part of the overall performance of the economy, and neoclassicals ignore it. They leave, these are outliers. Some exogenous event must have caused the Great Depression, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you look back on the sensible economic literature of the non-mainstream, the Schumpeters, the Fishers, and the Minskys, you find they took credit seriously, and that's what gave us the financial instability hypothesis. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about Minsky, talk about hedge and speculative and Ponzi financing. I prefer to focus on this role, where you really see Minsky linking in the role of credit into aggregate demand. It's the natural starting place for analysing the relation between debt and income. Now, that's not part of mainstream economics. In many ways, it hasn't been integrated by post-Keynesians properly as yet. Take an economy with a cyclical past that is now doing well. You have an inherited debt structure where it didn't do so well, so people are conservative. But because the economy has recovered, people who took on debt prosper. It turns out that it pays to lever. Therefore, the amount of debt which is regarded as acceptable starts to rise once more. You're back into a boom economy, and this is one of Minsky's classic statements: stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which investment is determined and the ownership of capital assets is determined. So the fundamental instability of the capitalist economy is upward. Tendency to transform doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability of a capitalist economy. That's one of the deepest pieces of wisdom, I think, in history of economics. Now, neoclassicals ignore Minsky, or they try to model him as an equilibrium framework. They do the same to Fisher. They both are explicitly non-equilibrium thinkers. You have to escape that practice. And of course, they try to put it in the theory and they find it doesn't work because they're putting in equilibrium. It does when you escape from the straitjacket of thinking in equilibrium terms. We should chuck micro-foundations in the garbage bin, probably include the Harvard Law Economics Department with the garbage bin, and work strictly from macroeconomics. And I want to show that you can actually derive Minsky's financial instability hypothesis strictly from strictly true economic definitions. So if I take the ratio of employment to population, I use lambda, in the Greek lowercase l, to indicate that, the wages share of GDP, omega, wages divided by GDP, and the private debt ratio, which I've now shown as a crucial part of macroeconomics, ratio of debt to private to income. If you simply differentiate those with respect to time, you get three dynamic definitional outcomes. They're strictly true. The employment rate will rise if employment grows faster than population. Wages share of GDP will grow if wages grow faster than GDP, and the debt ratio will rise if debt rises faster than GDP. Those are strictly true definitions still. To make them into a model, you need to use genuine simplifying assumptions, not the garbage that neoclassicals pull out of hats to pretend that equilibrium applies as they bring in more complexity into the real world. So I simply have wage change depending upon the rate of employment, the dreaded Phillips curve, and investment depending upon the rate of profit. And I use linear functions just for simplicity, not because I believe this isn't a linear. So what you get out of that is a model. This is in my Minsky software. This, by the way, is not the aspect of Minsky I want to teach Christine later. This is the nonlinear dynamics and complex systems side of the model. But what you see when you model those three definitions, simply put them into a dynamic framework, you find several things that actually happen in the real world. The most important from my point of view is that great moderation precedes a great recession, which is what we saw in the real world. Diminishing cycles followed by rising cycles. Bernanke congratulated himself on causing it. From my point of view, a catastrophe lay shortly ahead. You have rising private debt, which is what happened in the real world. And you also have, even though in this model I've got only the capitalists borrowing money, the workers are the ones who pay for it. Complex dynamics ends up being that the workers' income falls precisely as much as bankers' rises. So one of the best reasons to reduce the private debt and to reduce the income of bankers is because they're literally screwing the workers through the complex system of the economy. So there's a good reason to reduce the debt levels dramatically. So we need to understand money, and the main barrier to understanding money has been the economics profession, which is one reason I'd like to shut it down and get engineers to take over instead. And I built the software package I call Minsky for obvious reasons, to enable us to model money. And the part I do want to teach to Christine later, and to anybody else who wants to take a look at how to model a monetary system, simply uses the idea of assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. It's called the fundamental law of accounting. So if you show, if you have private banks putting credit dollars per year into deposit accounts and credit dollars per year into the loan account, that's creating money. And you look at the banking sector, that's the banking sector's view. From the point of view of the non-bank sector, and this is a point which modern monetary theory makes, there's no increase in the net equity of the private sector for borrowing money. And they borrow because they need money for economic transactions in a capitalist economy, but they don't change their net worth at all. On the other hand, when you look at government, it takes a few more tables to show the government system. But what the government does is put, I call it fiat dollars per year here. I refuse to use the word deficit, because deficit implies you drop money dropping out. When the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it puts net fiat dollars per year into deposit accounts and net fiat dollars per year into reserve accounts at the same time. For the non-bank sector, that therefore means they get an increase in their equity. And the central bank is just operating as a mechanism to transfer the money through from the Treasury's account to the accounts of the private banks at the central bank. And the Treasury's negative equity creates positive equity for the private sector. So we live in a mixed credit fiat world, and it's about time we understood it, because I think capitalist courtesy, neoclassicals courtesy of the nonsense they've written on climate change, which is worse than the nonsense they've written on money, are going to destroy capitalism before we work out how capitalism actually functions. So when you look at it this way, the government debt is just the wrong way. It's not debt. It's creating an asset for the private banks that earns interest, whereas normally reserves do not earn interest. And I have to say, by the way, I didn't realise this myself properly until I saw that claim in 17 Kelvin's the deficit myth, and I went through a model at Minsky and confirmed her argument. So I used to get that wrong in how the government created money. The central bank sales don't have any role apart from stopping the Treasury's account of the central bank going into overdraft. That's what the bonds actually do. They're not involved in the creation of money. The government could create that money by running an overdraft if it wanted to. It could equally sell the bonds directly to the central bank. There's no reason to sell those bonds to the private banks and have the central bank buy off the private banks. So again, we get this creation of positive equity for the non-bank side of the economy, or I'm getting a bit caught up in my words here, but the non-financial private sector, positive equity for them is created by running what we call the deficit. And that's a much better way to create a monetary economy than relying upon the banks, which both create debt that creates perverse behaviour by the private sector, and of course they've also done an appallingly bad job in financing the investment we really need in a capitalist economy. Now I want to show one of the advantages of putting this sort of work together in Minsky in a relatively simple model, because it enables you to do an experiment which we can't do in the real world. Because if you look back in the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge was convinced that his surplus was the reason the economy was doing so well. Notice the date, December 4, 1928, 1 year before a rather fun event. And in his State of the Union, he said, we've made drastic revisions to the revenue system, we've abolished taxes. The end result has been so increased taxable incomes that a surplus has been produced. The debt's been repaid, 1/3 of the national debt. Income has increased by 50%. And this is all due to the running the surplus. It's the cornerstone of prosperity. It must be continued. 8 months later, the Great Depression began. Now, can we see why? Well, if the government runs a surplus of 1% of GDP, what's being ignored by Coolidge and also still today ignored by mainstream economists is credit was rising at 5% of GDP at the same time. So if I feed those results into Minsky, what I get is a burning economy. Declining private debt, government debt ratio, but rising private debt. Now, what would have happened if credit had been zero? If it had just been Coolidge's surplus? What you would have seen is an economic collapse. So you can divine what happened in the past using a simple model in Minsky. So we need an alternative economics desperately to the nonsense we get from neoclassicals right now. My attempts here, the latest book I've written covers a lot of the logic I've discussed today in that presentation, the New Economics Manifesto. I have a Substack and a Patreon page, which I'd appreciate people joining. You can join for free, but I, of course, appreciate some assistance for the work that I'm doing. And I'm now getting a set of online courses. I have to apologise for some of the advertisements that the marketing company who approached me about this put out there appalling. They've finally realised their advertising doesn't work, and they've actually now let me offer a 50% discount, which means that would be $250 rather than $500 for the 16 lectures I'm now giving as part of that program. But for God's sake, let's stop learning neoclassical economics. Let's put it in the dustbin of history where it right well and truly belongs.
Thank you, Professor Keane. And Michael, go next.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And can you see that? Okay, good. Everything's working. So thank you for inviting me to talk about this. I want to start by saying that I agree with everything that Steve said, except vehemently on climate change. One thing that he said is that you don't need to throw neoclassical, that you need to throw neoclassical economics in the garbage bin. And I will argue that you don't. You can beat it with its own tools. And you can tell the same story that Steve told, because I completely agree with the story that he told. And this is based on a paper that we wrote several years ago now, and that is still, it's easy to sell at conferences like this, but it is a struggle among neoclassical economists, and that's putting it mildly. Here's the usual disclaimer. This is a research paper. It doesn't reflect any official opinions of our employers. So, I work at a central bank, and theories of banking play a key role in informing policy analysis, sometimes formally and sometimes rather informally, by sort of shaping the lens through which policymakers look at the world. And academic economics generally works with problematic, and that's putting it mildly, banking theories, whereby banks collect deposits in inverted commas from depositors and then lend out those deposits to borrowers, and banks do no such thing. This is a complete nonsense, and it's embarrassing that anybody would say this. And this is a real problem if it informs policy making, because there are lots of PhD economists in central banks. But let me also add, because I've presented a lot at central banks, fortunately, seasoned central bankers who actually understand the real world rather than the textbook tend to understand the issues very much better than that. So what I want to drive home today from a different angle to Steve's is that banks are not intermediaries of loanable funds. So in academia, you see that banking is modeled as intermediation of loanable funds. I will use ILF, the acronym, throughout now, where banks are intermediaries between savers and borrowers of physical resources. Physical resources means these are non-financial models. They are barter models. Banks are basically commodity traders, and that is obviously nonsense. I model banking as what I call financing through money creation, or FMC, where banks create ledger entry money, just like you saw in Steve's ledger entries. They create gross assets and liabilities. They are therefore financial models. Banks are creators and intermediaries of money, but the intermediation part is secondary to the creation part, I would argue, because the intermediation just moves existing deposits around and does not change their quantity, and thereby real activity. There is, of course, a nuance to this. If the velocity of circulation of a given stock of deposit increases a lot, that does have real effects. Now, this is the usual intermediation of loanable funds model. At the top, bank balance sheet in the middle, liabilities on the right-hand side, assets on the left-hand side. Somebody comes and dumps something at the bank, and then the bank lends it out to somebody else. I will talk to you about what that somebody dumps at the bank in a minute. At the bottom, you have the financing through money creation model, where somebody, say a factory or a company, industrial company, gets a loan of money and a deposit of money, because the loan is the way to create the deposit, then takes the deposit and engages in monetary exchange, whereby this deposit then moves around to somebody else, say the worker who works for the firm. But that's secondary, because maybe a week later it comes back to the firm because the worker needs to buy the goods that the firm has produced. That money circulates all the time, but the quantity is determined by the loan. And I look at this as a macroeconomist, and that's all I care about, not so much the micro flows of money. Now, why are deposits non-financial transactions in the standard model? This collecting deposits and lending them out notion. Let's look at a real world deposit. Household A and B bank with banks A and B, and A has done a job like mowing the lawn for B, and B writes a check, and A deposits it in his bank A. This check only has value because the deposit already exists in bank B, because otherwise B would have written a bad check. So the only thing that this does, a deposit of a check, is it moves an existing deposit. It does not create a new one. However, in the loanable funds model, somebody deposits something new in the bank and the bank lends it out. That cannot be a deposit of a real world check or of any other financial instrument, by the argument that I have just made. Now, central bank money is not loanable funds either. Like in this case, Bank A would have settled the check with Bank B to receive value for it in central bank reserves. It would now have more central bank reserves, but B would have less. Now, central bank reserves cannot be lent to non-banks, only to other banks, which is also something stunningly often ignored by neoclassical economists. Central bank money is not something you can lend to somebody else. Okay, so none of this is loanable funds, but there are deposits in loanable funds models. What are they? They do not represent financial transaction. Instead, they must clearly represent physical transaction, meaning that a farmer comes to the bank and dumps his wheat in the forecourt of the bank, and the bank then lends it to the cafeteria of a large industrial company to make bread. Literally, that's what must be going on, because the financial story doesn't add up. Now, FMC deposits are a financial transaction. Let's say I'm a borrower X, my name is X. I simultaneously receive a new loan and a new deposit when I go to the bank, because the way to disperse the loan is to credit it to my deposit account. My deposits can only increase, or the aggregate deposits can only increase through new loans, not through saving. Assume loans do not change, and assume I try to save, then my deposit can only increase if somebody else's decreases. Doesn't do anything. An attempt to save doesn't do anything to change the quantity of deposits, unless loans also change. But then it's not about the savings, it's about the loans. And the ledger additions involve no intermediation, because the loan is in my name and the deposit is. The loan is the right of the bank to receive future installments from me, and the deposit is the obligation of the bank to deliver current funds to me. Now, the magic of banking is that banks, and only banks, have the right to declare that their obligation to deliver current funds is current funds. They have an obligation to give me current funds. That's what the deposit is. And they alone can declare that that obligation is funds, is money. That's what banking is. There's nothing illegitimate about this, but it's good to understand it. Now, ILF versus FMC, money and real activity. What's constrained spending in the real world? Is it real income and an income expenditure constraint in the way that Steve was talking about, where borrowing is getting part of somebody else's income, meaning resources? This is nonsense. It is actually income plus new deposit in a purchasing power constraint, because what matters for how much I can spend is not my income, but my purchasing power. And I can easily, if I have decent credit, go to the bank and augment my purchasing power with a loan that creates a new deposit, and I instantly have more money to spend than my income in the form of this deposit. And that's how banking works. And this is independent of physical resources, except, but that's very indirect, the bank will look at my collateral, my physical, wealth, in order to decide, do we want to lend to this guy? But this additional purchasing power, even though I don't have the income, the additional purchasing power mobilizes that income, because when I have more purchasing power, I go to a firm, that firm, and many other people do that too, that firm will hire additional workers and make more stuff than it otherwise would have made. That's the notion of what Steve had in his budget constraint, that credit adds to income and expenditure. That's if credit is actually credit for real activity rather than credit for purchases of existing asset, which is a different thing. Expenditure equals income holds ex post, but ex ante expenditure is determined by purchasing power, not by income. Financial stability implications. ILF deposits come from a physical process of saving resources, which by nature is very slow and continuous. Saving is not something that jumps around a lot, and you see that in data. FMC deposits are created on a computer, which can be instantaneous, discontinuous. Nothing physical constrains it, no central bank reserves constrain it. Only the attitude towards lending of banks and their borrowers constrains it. And that can be very fickle and dependent on moods, and it can turn very quickly. So that means ILF and FMC have completely different financial stability implications. And in fact, we have now in our latest work estimated an FMC model. This is in the context of CBDC, which I work on a lot. And we have found that when you have a proper model of banks creating purchasing power rather than intermediating resources, you found that financial shocks, which are shocks to the demand and supply for money, account for around 50% of business cycle volatility, real business cycle volatility. So this whole notion that credit and its volatility is so crucial for the business cycle is there in black and white in our state-of-the-art estimates of a neoclassical, I would add, business cycle model. Okay, so quick illustration, then data, then conclusion. Two quantitative models. This comes out of our original paper. Here we're comparing an ILF and an FMC model that are identical, except for the ILF FMC difference, which is only to be found in the budget constraints of the agents, which in the ILF model are this sort of income equal expenditure constraint, whereas in the FMC model, it's a proper purchasing power constraint. That's the only difference. Now here we have 16 quarters of 4 years on the horizontal axis. We show various variables. The solid line in each case is the FMC model. The dotted line is the ILF model. And the shock is that banks start to lend less. Okay, so you can see that. I don't know whether you can see my mouse moving, but you have bank loans and bank deposits in the FMC model declining by 5%, which is roughly the same as saying 5% of GDP, which is a large but not unprecedented magnitude, even in a single quarter, for what banking systems are sometimes doing. Okay, now in the FMC model, the shock does actually create that. In the ILF model, that can't happen because the banks are constrained by how much wheat the farmer wants to dump in the forecourt. And that doesn't change so much because the harvest is already in, right? It's a real model, it's a barter model, so the banks can't move that much on quantities. So instead, because the underlying shock is that banks think their borrowers are more risky now, so they're going to charge a higher interest rate rather than on credit, rather than reducing the quantity of credit. And when you look at what that means for output over here and inflation down here, the contractions in GDP and inflation are much larger in the financing model than in the loanable funds model. And this matters a great deal because it tells you that financial instability has much bigger implication, and this particular illustration is not even that good. I could show you more extreme ones. It depends on the nature of the shock. It means that financial instability has bigger implications for real instability, which at the end of the day is what we really care about. Okay, now let's look at some stylized facts. In the data, there are large and rapid changes in financial sector balance sheets. The FMC model predicts that, the ILF model doesn't because it is based on the notion of saving. So here what we have is the D log of assets on the horizontal axis and the D log of debt on the vertical axis. Those are the red dots, and the D log of equity, which is the blue dots, which we're going to mostly ignore here. D log times 100 is the percent change. And those are basically time series for banking systems in the US, the Eurozone, Germany, France, over a few decades. Every dot represents a quarter. And what you see is that changes in debt versus changes in assets lie on something close to a 45-degree line, because as the FMC model would predict, new assets create new debt, bank debt. And therefore the two move virtually one for one. And if you also look on the magnitude of these changes, you see 2, 4, 6% there on the horizontal axis. This is a percent change in a single quarter. The credit is very volatile. Bank balance sheets are very volatile. They are at least twice as volatile as real variables, and that matters a great deal. And here's something related. Here we're not looking at those dots. Instead, we're looking at the time series themselves. This is from the early 90s until 2017. And the black line is what I want you to look at. Those are changes in bank balance sheet, changes in credit. And you see in the middle there where it gets rocky, that's the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Bank credit massively contracted. Just look at the top left, the United States, tells you most of what you need to know. Massive contraction in bank credit, very volatile. You see this is very jagged here, the large changes in credit quarter on quarter. Now the green line shows you the saving to the GDP ratio. And according to the loanable funds model, that's what should drive bank balance sheet. Not much action there. Saving is very smooth by comparison to bank balance sheet. And in fact, in the global financial crisis, saving went up. That would lead you to believe, oh, bank balance sheet must have expanded in the global financial crisis. Well, as we see here, they did not, right? And so that's another piece of evidence. So the FMC model is much more consistent with this story. So conclusions, and this is where I get back to the theme of this session. First of all, we developed theoretical frameworks, and I continue using them to this day, where ILF banks function is just resource allocation, which, you know, banks function is not resource allocation, it's purchasing power allocation, which is related to resource allocation, but it's far from the only thing. FMC banks function are purchasing power allocation and purchasing power creation, where I would argue that the creation is much more important for business cycles. Then we did a model comparison where we find that financing or FMC models have very different properties that are consistent with the data, namely far larger, far faster changes in bank lending, much larger effects on the real economy. And as I said, our latest work where we rigorously estimate a business cycle model bears this out. Now, why does this matter? Because that's the theme of this session. And I have done a lot of work on monetary system design, on alternative monetary systems with either the Chicago Plan, which is an old paper of mine more than 10 years ago, or CBDC, which I've worked a lot on recently. In fact, our 2016 paper was the paper that coined the acronym CBDC. This is by now hard to believe, it's 7 years ago. Now, I argue that you can only understand CP and CBDC if you understand banks, because banks are what you would either replace under the Chicago Plan or modify with CBDC. And there are two aspects to this. One is business cycles. Business cycles means fluctuations around the mean, and economic efficiency, which concerns the mean itself, because the mean itself could change because of CBDC or Chicago Plan. So let's talk about business cycles, fluctuations around the mean. In our CBDC paper, including the most recent ones, the interaction of CBDC with an FMC bank is completely different to the interaction with an ILF bank. So if you want to understand what CBDC does, but you use a model that has nothing to do with what banks do and instead models them as a warehouse, good luck to you. And this is not going to result in very competent policy advice. And so one thing that we find is that an active CBDC policy can be highly effective against financial volatility because banks have the potential, and in fact, our estimates indicate that they use the potential to sometimes create quite a lot of financial volatility, and that can be offset by CBDC policies. If that financial volatility isn't even there in your model, then why do you want CBDC? Okay, it's simplifying it a little bit, but that's a story. The Chicago Plan, again, it has completely different implications depending on the model of banking used. With the FMC model, the Chicago Plan removes a major source of financial volatility, which is the ability of banks to create money to fund new loans. Okay, and here, if I have a little bit of time, because I have only one more slide after this, I would like to return to something that came up first thing this morning in your roundtable where you talked about inequality. And I hadn't thought about putting that here, but it belongs here. What is the reason for, people were talking at length about, oh, the financial system has created so much inequality, but it remained nebulous, to me at least, in the discussion of how it does that. Just exactly how. And I would argue that it is the ability of banks to create money out of thin air that has a lot to do with this. Because, if you just think about, you borrow to buy an asset, that in itself doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't do anything to your wealth because you have created an asset and a liability of equal value. But when you have access to money creation at the source, or perhaps one step removed because you're a favored customer of the bank, then you have access to creating economic opportunities that present themselves first and buy up the juiciest assets that are around, including the government, if you get my drift. Then you have the ability to really quickly pick up the juiciest assets and keep them to yourself. And that creates, that converts gross assets, which are the asset that you bought with a loan of equal value, into net assets, which is that asset is now soon going to be worth a lot more than the liability that you incurred, and you run away with the rest, and then you build net worth. You don't just build gross assets, you build net worth. That I thought was worth adding to what we discussed this morning. So finally, economic efficiency, the mean itself. I would argue, as did Steve Keen, is that money is not neutral in the long run, especially when you talk about money as including, which it does, in fact, the majority is bank money. And more money fosters more economic exchange, and more economic exchange leads to more output. And that includes bank deposit money and central bank money. It is therefore at least worth looking at whether leaving all money creation with commercial banks could be suboptimal from this point of view. And we have found when we're looking at the mean itself, CBDC or Chicago plan can increase output through a combination of lower interest rates, real interest rate, not just nominal, when you issue central bank money by buying back government debt. That is, first of all, because money can pay a very low interest rate because it has a convenience yield. People hold it for much more than just their financial return, which means the financial return can be low. Second, by withdrawing defaultable debt and issuing non-defaultable equity-like money in turn, that means you now have less defaultable instruments outstanding, and that means lower risk premium, even on the debt that remains outstanding after you've withdrawn some of it in order to issue CBDC. So two reasons for lower interest rates and lower interest costs, and therefore also from the government's point of view, fiscal space. And that leads to point two: when you have fiscal space, you can use it. And what we say, one of the ways to use it would be to lower taxes on work and to lower taxes on saving. And that in any neoclassical economic model would give rise to efficiency gains and higher output. And finally, the cheaper you can create a larger money stock more cheaply by doing at least some of it through public money creation in combination with private money creation, at least under CBDC. And that also reduces the cost of doing business. So those are the gains in terms of economic efficiency, in terms of business cycles, of having public money. And understanding these gains has to be in the framework of a model of money where the other form of money is created through book entries and not through banks intermediating wheat from a farmer. And I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm just going to wait for my slides. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So, what is at stake? So the presentation so far alerted us to the potential significance of money creation by commercial banks for business cycles and for economic crisis. And these are certainly first-order concerns. Yet, I want to suggest that the problems run even deeper and kind of latch on to Michael's last part when he talks about the mean, kind of what is the everyday implications. So my focus is this presentation is based on a paper called Money Creating Banks and the Market Price of Time. And the effort of this paper is to uncover exactly this, the everyday effects. And I don't mean the everyday effects of potentially sowing the seeds for the next crisis or next cycle, though that might be happening too, but really focus on and showing that there are far-reaching and problematic macroeconomic outcomes right here and right now, kind of in the everyday life of the macroeconomy. So the approach of this paper is a bit in a similar spirit of Michael's. So what I want to see is let's try to take a traditional model and see how much we can say. And it actually turns out that we can say quite a lot, even with kind of staying in the framework of conventional macroeconomics. Specifically, I use the so-called cash and advance model. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm happy to describe the model for anyone who's interested afterwards. The idea of this model is just to make two versions of it, very similarly to what Michael did. So, with a lot of imagination, I call this economy A. This is meant to be kind of the standard model. So here we have banks that can intermediate, so they can make loans, but they do not create money. So making loans means that they first have to raise the money from somewhere. And here the money supply, as a consequence, consists of outside money only. So outside money meaning money that is created outside or just exists outside of the private sector. So you can think of it as central bank money, or if that helps you more, you can think of it as gold, something that's nature given. And then keeping everything else fixed. So like Michael said, we want to compare apples with apples. I create a second economy which is identical in every respect, except for that I allow for a competitive bank and commercial banks to create money, specifically in the form of demand deposits, which is the kind of money that dominates the real world. So here the money supply can at least consist of both outside money and this stock of bank-created money to the extent that it actually circulates. Now, economy A serves as a benchmark in two ways. First of all, it's just a benchmark that allows us to see what the effect of money creation is in the real economy. But it also allows us to gauge how much we're missing when traditionally we use models without money creation in them. So, standard economic theory, as I presented at the beginning, at least if we set aside times of financial turbulence that are more complicated, they would predict that these two economies, the economy with and without money creation, in terms of the real economic outcomes, are identical. They're just going to differ in terms of the nominal money supply. But upon closer look, that's not at all what we find. So, money creation by commercial banks, compared to a world where banks would only intermediate, leads to no? Okay. Can you go on?
It should work.
Okay. So what I can show with this model is that money creation by commercial banks actually affects the relative price that is absolutely key for macroeconomic income, for macroeconomic outcomes, and that is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is really the price that connects the present with the future. And specifically what money creation tends to do is to push down the real interest rate. Or to phrase it in a different way, if that helps you more, equivalently, or an equivalent way of saying that is that it makes credit cheaper. And possibly too cheap, and I'll get into why I say too cheap a little bit later. Now, this in turn has real effects, not just nominal effects in the economy. When the real interest rate changes, this directly influences, example, real investment, and in turn then real aggregate output. And specifically, with a lower real interest rate, a lot of investment projects that firms could undertake that before did not seem profitable, now do. Even if, and here's the problem, they're not actually worthwhile undertakings from the point of view of society. And as credit gets cheap, we tend to find ourselves in an economy that is hungry for credit, simply because it's cheap. So the economy easily gets characterized by pervasive indebtedness and low levels of bank capital. And this we see in the model when we put in money creation by commercial banks. And roughly speaking, or there's this pretty simple rule of thumb here, which is to say that the greater the stock of bank-created money, the cheaper is credit in the model. And given the vast amounts of bank-issued money that we have in our modern economies, this gives us plenty of reason to expect that it really, really matters. So what is going on here? Why do we find ourselves with cheap credit when commercial banks create money? Why is this not part of macroeconomic textbooks? So how does it differ? So traditionally in macroeconomics, I would argue, there's been a focus on the effect of money creation by commercial banks, or the effect that it has on the real economy via its effect on the total money supply. So as bank lending changes and then the total money supply changes, that might have real effects. And what I show here is that that's really only part of the story. So that's why we typically expect real effects to happen in times of financial turbulence, because then the money supply moves a lot. But that's really only one part of it. So what I show is that, or the key channel in this paper is another thing that's happening, and that is really important, is that the money creation, or the ability to create money, really changes the bank's supply of credit. Specifically, it gives the bank an ability to supply greater amounts of credit and makes it profitable for the bank at interest rates to supply it at lower interest rates that wouldn't have been profitable if it were only an intermediary. So this is the key channel in my paper. So what I want to emphasize that this effect on the bank's supply of credit, that's present even in the case of a perfectly stable stock of bank-created money. So even in times that seem perfectly stable, this force is still likely to be there. Of course, in and of itself, it's not necessarily a cause for concern that we have cheaper credit. So what is my basis for claiming that this might actually be a cause for concern? To understand that, I think it's helpful to back up a little and understand or think about the traditional understanding of banking that both Steve and Michael have explained. So we typically think of and model banks as we said, intermediaries. So they help the flow of funds from savers to borrowers. And in principle, of course, savers and borrowers can interact directly. So typically, they use the bank because the bank provides some kind of beneficial service. So the bank is typically good at diversifying risk, pooling resources, monitoring borrowers, and so on. And in this story, in the intermediation story, the bank is really building a bridge between savers and borrowers. And there's, typically, the better the bridge, it could well be that credit gets cheaper. And if that's the reason for cheaper credit, that the bank is doing a good job of matching the savers and the borrowers, there wouldn't really be any cause for concern, or at least not an obvious one. So what I want to emphasize is that that's not at all what's going on here. Credit is not cheaper because there's a greater supply of loanable funds. Say to, as I said, one could hypothesize maybe they're doing these intermediation services better, but that's not the mechanism. Instead, what I show in this paper is that the money creation enables banks to extend credit above and beyond the supply of loanable funds. And that's really how credit expands. So what the, I'll back that one. So that's really what's happening here. As commercial banks are able to create money, they are no longer, or they no longer need to raise a dollar for every dollar that they lend out. And by eliminating that step, is exactly what causes the creation of money to act as a cheap source of funding. And usually, there are many counter-arguments that say that, well, that might be true, that the bank is creating money, but then at the end of the day, the bank is still constrained by things such as profitability, solvency, the money was just created, it's not going to stay with the borrower, it's going to start traveling in the economy. And all of these things are perfectly true. That's exactly why bank or money creation is finite, both in the real world and in the model. But what I show is that all these reasons, even when they're true, just provide remarkably little discipline for bank credit, and much less of a disciplining force on bank credit than is commonly attributed to it. So before I close, I also want to make a conceptual point. So I've highlighted the effect that we should expect money creation to have, even in normal times that are not suffering from financial crisis or business cycles. And conceptually, proving this relationship theoretically between money creation by commercial banks and a cheaper price of credit gives us a completely new lens with which to look at credit markets, and I want to highlight that. So just let me use a practical example, and then we're actually, in a way, connecting up again to economic crisis. So think about the period in the US that preceded the financial crisis in 2007-08. So the final narrative of what caused the crisis is yet to be written, or at least yet to be agreed upon, even if it is written. But certainly there was a lot of attention paid to how conspicuously cheap and credit was in the period preceding the crisis. And when you look at credit markets through the view of banks as intermediaries, what you need to do in order to explain cheap credit is to find somewhere in the world a large pile of savings, because that's what ultimately finances credit. And so we have the global savings gap hypothesis that was put forth by Bernanke in several famous speeches. And this was a hypothesis that said that, well, maybe credit in the US is so cheap because of the large current account surpluses that were run by China and Japan and oil exporting countries and so on. So these countries were big net savers, and then this would be the large pile of savings that explain the cheap credit conditions in the US. Now, I'm not going to try by any means to settle that debate, but I just want to point out that when we understand that money creation by commercial banks pushes down the price of credit, we just have a completely new area to look at. And that's an area that we have not yet properly explored, and that this paper just points to that that's something that could be a fruitful area of further study. So it just gives us completely new glasses with which to look at credit markets. And with that, I'm going to end, and I'll invite our eminent commentator up to the stage.
Do you see the room?
mic here. Hello. You ready to go? Okay. Well, no, that's okay. I can speak also from here if you want. Does this work? Yeah. Yep. Okay. I'm a professor. I'm used to the tech not working. So thank you very much. You've heard three. I prepared these remarks before I heard the talks, so I may have to adjust something. But what's interesting to me about this is there's sort of three different modeling strategies for trying to get at this intuition about banks as creators of credit, and now you're going to see a fourth one, okay? Which maybe some of you have seen before, because this is the money view. This is and what the difference between the money view and these is that it's not actually aggregative. It's not macroeconomics so much, you know, but it should add up to macroeconomics. So that's why and so maybe I will suggest that this is the right way. But the point is we agree essentially on the important point. And so here's my way. Magic, we heard magic. I like to use the word alchemy. Historically, people have used the word flux to talk about this aspect. And you can see that the first line there is the creation of deposits through making loans between a business and a bank. And that's what we've seen now 3 times, okay, with different models. And I'm showing it, maybe one difference is that I'm showing the same process happening between the government and the bank, or the banking system, or the central bank. To point out that one of the sort of underlying issues, what's at stake in this magic, okay, in this alchemy, in this flux, okay? There's sort of the first point there is that there's sort of contested terrain. So who gets to use this magic? Okay, and for what purpose? Is it private business for profit, or is it the central bank that's using it for capital development of the nation, or for fighting a war, or whatever? So there's contested terrain. That's one point. A second question, that's the second bullet point there, is this? Are we talking about, when we say it's contested terrain? Does that mean there's like a certain amount of alchemy that you could do? And if some goes to business and less goes to the government, or could they both be satisfied? You know, could you just use this magic for both of them? And I think that's also an issue. And some if you listen carefully, you could hear dancing around this question. You know, is this about credit allocation or actually aggregate expansion of credit? So that's one point about contested terrain that I want to bring out. That's what's at stake. The second point, which is sort of also in all three of these presentations, is alchemy as a source of potential instability. Instability in the financial economy, but also instability in the real economy. And the idea here seems to be that this is a sort of free variable, okay? That the reserves of bank reserves or capital requirements are not sufficient to constrain this, and so it can kind of get out of hand. This magic can get out of hand and lead to booms and busts and so forth. And that in some of the papers there was discussion about the central bank that because it gets out of hand, that then requires the central bank to somehow intervene as a lender of last resort and bail out for excessive flux. So this is what people are worried about, that this magic could get overdone and then have social costs or taxpayers or bank bailouts or something. So this is my attempt to kind of put in one slide what's at stake, and also to translate this discussion into my more normal sort of balance sheet language that I'm used to. In order to understand what anyone else is saying, you have to first translate it into your own language. So that's what that is. So let me just add one thing to this. In the history of thinking about money, this has always been a debate about flux and being concerned about this magic of banking. This is not a new thing. And in particular, the debate between the banking school and the currency school was really all about that, you know, the magic of banking. So Tuke and Fullerton, I'm just giving their names. These are the heroes of the banking school. And perhaps we should mention Bagehot there too. He was certainly a banking school guy, although he didn't think that it would naturally police itself. But Tuke and Fullerton did, because they had another mechanism that they called reflux, okay? That if there were excess money, there were ways in which it would naturally be destroyed. That was their idea, okay? And so none of that's in any three of these papers, okay? So that's the first thing I wanna point out, okay? And then we're gonna talk about how that works. This, I wanna also point out, Bagehot, Hawtrey, Hicks talks about banks creating money, you know, that's a pretty orthodox guy, he got a Nobel Prize. So this is not, in fact, a controversial point of view, okay, I think. It is certainly true that standard general equilibrium models, and I think it's really the Walrasian blitzkrieg, you know, that has really destroyed our understanding of money. That this was understood before everyone decided, oh, well, general equilibrium, Arrow de Broglie, and that really is the problem in thinking. And even the people who created it, like Hans, says, yeah, we kind of can't understand money using this. So to some extent, this is also about the old view versus the new view. Keynes, 1937, the ex-ante theory of interest being the old view, and Gurley and Shaw, the debt intermediation view, so that's remediation right there, 1960, and then Tobin, 63, and that's where we never have understood money since then. So I want to just say something about reflux, okay, because I want to say that this has to be part of the story about what's disciplining this. So I'm showing you there on the left-hand column, that's what each row is supposed to be demonstrating. And so you can see flux in the first row. You saw that before, right? The creation of deposits by creating loans, just expanding the balance sheet on both sides. Now I'm showing that microeconomically, being used to make a payment, to buy a house, that I'm buying a house from you. I'm deliberately having this be buying a house, so that it's an existing house, so that it's not creating income, it's not creating employment, it's not doing any of the things that your models are doing, so that you can just see the money part, okay? And then you could add this into your model, okay? And so then you have a deposit, and the question is, you have a different bank, and so that deposit is now in your bank, and the way this deposit is being funded in the first place is through a Fed funds loan, FS for Fed funds because I'm American here, is from my bank to borrowing from your bank. So we're not transferring reserves, right? This is just interbank borrowing. It's important to appreciate that the marginal cost of funds from this point of view, okay, is the interbank rate. Right, that's the interest rate that you want to be thinking about, because that's what it costs my bank to fund my loan. And that might be the end of the story. If society wants to hold this new money creation, that would be money funding of mortgage lending. If society wants to hold this, that's the end of the story. But it might not be the end of the story. It may be, and this is what the banking school very much emphasized, okay, that they were thinking about a world of a lot of short-term credit, so there's a lot of loans that are maturing all the time, and so it can easily flow back out of the economy again, and that's what the second to last line there, that's reflux, where the money flows right back out again in repayment of some other loan, and so the money supply is not permanently increased, and in fact the credit supply is not permanently increased. You know, you've just increased the credit, and so it's in my Hedlin's article, paper, she talks about the breathing of the system in and out. So there, breathe in, breathe out. Okay, that's reflux. For the modern economy, we don't have so many short-term loans, and these mortgage loans are long-term. As a matter of fact. So there's another way that money can flow out through my bank selling this loan to an insurance company that's using to fund an annuity. And you can see in the last slide, I call that capital funding. Okay, so the money can increase, but it can decrease, and there are these mechanisms. That's true at the commercial banking level. It's also true at the central banking level. I have a little paper about that. Payment versus funding, the law of reflux for today, that I wrote for the Fester for a famous post-Keynesian Shimada. Because it seemed to be this was a conversation that we needed to have. So here's the proposals that they're making. I think they sort of agree, you know, that if you think that this alchemy is a cause of instability, you want to rein it in some way, you know, by the Chicago Plan, CBDC, or something for the purpose of stability, or maybe you want to let loose central bank alchemy for the public purpose, for economic development, direct credit allocation. Low interest rates have been mentioned here as an incentive. I want to say some words about those things. What is missing from the discussion? I have a couple of slides later on about your model, but since you didn't talk about your model. I'm not going to do that. We can do that offline. So I'll just make this my last slide. So I mentioned the reflex, okay, is missing from this discussion. So there's elasticity and discipline sort of in the way banking works, okay? That's not sort of being modeled, I think, adequately in these approaches. There's another thing that I maybe had a little peeve about. In all these models, the best money is outside money. Okay, it's an asset that is nobody's liability. It's government money, and I always prefer to think that all money is the highest form of credit, never fiat, certainly not equity. So maybe we can have some debate about that. So I tend to model the economy always as balance sheets, so it's always inside money. If you're thinking about it properly. Also, all three of these models are domestic, completely. There's no international sector, so you could set the interest rate anywhere you want. You know, there's not any arbitrage or exchange rates or things like that. I think that we need to stop modeling like that. Okay? The world we're living in is a world of global money, and the question is, what happens to this process if you're thinking about it in a world of global money? Does this all still hold? Okay. And the final point I'll make is that, to go back to the first slide, that I was when I was talking about reflux, that the money rate of interest, okay, in my money view, okay, is determined in the interbank market for funding of loans. Okay, so it's a money rate of interest. It's not a real rate of interest. It doesn't have anything to do with time preference. It has to do with the pattern of cash flows, cash inflows, and cash outflows. In the money view way of thinking about that, it's the price of delaying settlement. It's the price of not settling this thing that you owe because the deposits were delayed. There is no real settlement constraint in any of these models, and so that's why sometimes the interest rate appears like a free variable. Okay, which is particularly, I'll pick on our host here. It's her model is actually a model with a continuum of equilibrium with any interest rate. Okay, so it's like a free variable. I don't think in the real world the interest rate is a free variable. I think it's a market variable. Okay, I think that thinking that it's determined by time preference, okay, is not correct. The money rate of interest is determined in the money market. Okay, and that's what and you can't have a money market if you're aggregating. Okay, a money market is a relationship between banks. Okay, so that decision to model this at an aggregative level leaves out kind of an important detail from my point of view. And well, this is what you're missing. Aren't you glad? Okay. The observations. Well, maybe I'll just leave. This is some observations about your model, and we can talk about that. Let me just stop there.
Thank you, okay, so I think Stephen, Michael, and I have a lot that we want to discuss with Perry, but since we want to keep this democratic and we just have another 5 minutes or so until we should wrap up, I thought let's open up and see if anyone has a question. We might not have a lot of time to answer the questions, but let's take maybe 2 or 3 to kind of just feel what people are wondering about. Yeah.
Hi. Perry, could you just go back over that one point about the annuities? Because I wrote Annuities for Dummies. You were implying that there was a destruction of credit when the money went to the insurance companies, right?
Yeah, that's easy to say. Is this on? Yes. It's because it does. Okay. No, not at all. Okay, there's a destruction of money. There's not a destruction of credit. Okay, it's the credit still is expanded. If you look back, it's now pulled out. But if you look back at the slide, you'll see that in both the pure reflex case, okay, in the pure reflex case, credit goes back to where it was before because the loan is being repaid, and money goes back to where it was before. In the capital funding case, the credit stays out there. It's just now funded in the capital market, okay, instead of and the money goes away. It's because the household is is holding an annuity. The reason that you're confused is because I didn't want to put another column with the insurance company there. But there is an implied another column there that's issuing that annuity as a liability and holding the loan as an asset. So I think I got it right.
Let's take 2 questions in a row.
I followed what Perry was saying, and I'm kind of used to thinking about this kind of money creation finance perspective. What I'm a little bit hazier on is the loanable funds model, and I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around that. Is the idea that if I'm the saver and I put my money in the bank, the bank isn't giving me like a demand deposit, or it's a demand deposit that I'm not going to spend, and that's why it's not. That's why it's something different, because if I'm saving the money, I mean, like, it feels like it's an equivalent thing, right? If I put money in the bank and then that bank lends the money out, I also have these deposits, so I still kind of have the money that I put in the bank, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at with that?
If you try to model loanable funds, what I find you have is fundamentally like a building society where you don't have demand deposits. So the saver's money goes down, the borrower's money goes up. It is literally as if you lend to a family member, which I don't recommend doing. But you don't have the spending power, the person you lend to does have the spending power. It's completely irrelevant to the real world. And like a major reason why is the neoclassical school in general doesn't want to think about money. As Mee says in the opening to her paper, pardon me pronouncing your name wrongly, I'm sure, but they don't want to think about money, and loanable funds lets them not think about money. That's really the role of the loanable funds model.
Thanks for the 3 presentations. I have a question about your view on cash in advance.
Speak up, please.
Yeah, thanks for the 3 presentations. I have a question mainly for the cash in advance sort of approach, modelling strategy, as Perry called it. So that was one of the sort of early attempts to introduce money general equilibrium from the 60s, and I'm wondering, there's sort of vexed discussion around trying to do that, whether, and from your work, you find that a suitable sort of workaround some of the problems that have been highlighted with how do we conceive of money in the economy? So, do you find the cash advance a suitable mechanism to sort of work around the conception of money? And that question also goes to Michael, because I understood from Perry's concern that it doesn't quite, Perry and Steve, I guess, would say that it doesn't quite capture a monetary economy with all of its sort of richness. And I'm just wondering whether your view is that it's sufficient to show that. I'd be interested in what Michael had to say as well. Thanks.
I'll just be brief, Michael, and then you can chime in. And then I think we'll actually have to wrap up, but any questions you have, just catch us out in the corner. So I'll just say something kind of generally that, which is exactly what you're alluding to. So in economics models in general, we economists are well aware that our models are just not very good at capturing the phenomenon of money. And that's well known in the profession, so that there's a lot of kind of work within the profession to kind of find what can we find models that we feel comfortable with and that capture money in a good way. We don't have them yet, definitely not. We have cash advance models, that's one attempt. They definitely have drawbacks. So I'm not trying to kind of pretend like they don't. We have a lot of models that are much more careful and kind of been a lot of work on that more recently. They're much more careful in modeling money, but also tend to be a lot more complex. So the model strategy that I went with here was basically to say, let's take one of those kind of simpler shortcut models that definitely have drawbacks, but let's still see what happens when we put money creation by commercial banks in them and just see what we can say. And I think we can say a lot, even if we're still struggling to find a framework that we're really, really kind of comfortable with at the end of the day. Michael, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. Cash advance is a shortcut, and I've written another paper with Xuan Wang where we simply made the assumption that any payment you want to make to pay your workers, to buy intermediate goods, etc., you need to use bank deposits. Okay, that's all we're assuming, which is by and large what happens unless you're dealing in drugs. And so basically that amounts at the end of the day to cash in advance. Because I mean, it amounts to deposits in advance, not cash in advance, which is, I think, the better thing to assume, deposits in advance. It just says, if you want to make a payment, this is what you have to use. Is that wrong? No, it's not. And cash in advance doesn't capture the full complexity of what that means, and we model it in that model, but it is a useful shorthand, because if you wanted to build such a complex model every time, you could write one paper a year. I wanted to say one thing about your paper. You say that money creation by banks can expand the money supply beyond the supply of loanable funds. I think that's dangerous. Don't give them an inch. Because there is no supply of loanable funds, zero, okay? And I think that's very important. The other point that you made, you wondered in the open economy, the savings glut hypothesis of Bernanke, is there the same kind of logic at play? It is. We've actually written a paper about that, debunking, among other things, the savings glut hypothesis. The paper is called How Does International Capital Flow? Originally, we wanted to call it International Capital Does Not Flow, but that was a little too radical. But that was the idea. Basically, international capital flows are modeled as loanable funds flows in the literature in neoclassical economics, and capital does not flow like that. Capital flows through gross flows, and we debunked the savings glut. Now, I wanted to say something about Perry's last 4 points and what's missing in the model. I don't think any of those 4 things is missing in my model. Reflux was the first. That's not missing. We have influx and reflux is completely symmetric. Secondly, outside money, it's missing, but it's simplification. We're right now working on an extension which also has inside money. It does not change anything about what happens with bank money creation. That model will have settlement in reserves. We already have that in that paper that I just mentioned. How does international capital flow? Because there we need to model both domestic and foreign banks, and there is settlement between domestic and foreign banks, and you need nostro and vostro accounts, and that is explicitly in the model. It does not change the logic of bank money creation. And we're right now doing it in a closed economy also to talk about QE and QT. Again, it doesn't change the basic logic. Domestic versus international was number 3. As I said, we have that paper on the international dimension. You can't always tell all stories in one paper, so sometimes we write closed economy models. Finally, the money rate of interest. I agree that the rate of interest is not determined the way it's often done in neoclassical models by technological growth and the rate of time preference and some sort of R star or natural rate of interest. I don't think there's any such thing in that sense. But I have a different idea of how that is created. And I'm working on that, but that's not even on paper yet. But I just wanted to mention that I believe that's not going to be inconsistent with the rest of the framework. It's just a different way in which the real interest rate, which anchors the system, is determined. But everything around that, including all the spreads and credit creation, etc., is not going to be affected by that to a first approximation. So I think, at least in my framework, I believe I have or am about to take care of all the concerns that you raised, and I'll leave it there.
So I would say on that happy note, we'll end the session, but please just grab us in the corridor if you want to keep a discussion going.
Again, the framework that I showed was just a domestic economy. The thing is, economists understand money so badly. Simply explaining what domestic money is a huge advance over the nonsense, say, with 2 exceptions that the mainframe does right now. When you include the international money, of course, you get a far more complicated picture, but the framework I've built in Minsky is capable of modeling that.
And on that happy note.